The search team found his tracks in the snow 3 miles from the trailhead. The prints were clear and well-defined, pressed into 8 inches of fresh powder that had fallen overnight. They followed a logical path along the ridge, staying on the established trail, showing no signs of confusion or distress. The stride length was consistent. The boot pattern matched the Salomon X Ultra hiking boots that Kevin Marsh had been wearing when he left his vehicle at 5:45 that morning. The tracks continued for approximately 200 yards, past the point where searchers first picked them up. Then they stopped. They did not turn around. They did not veer off the trail into the trees. They did not show any indication that Kevin had fallen or been injured or encountered anything that would explain what happened next. The tracks simply ended, as if Kevin Marsh had been walking along the ridge and then ceased to exist mid-stride. The snow around the final footprint was undisturbed. No drag marks, no signs of a struggle, no animal tracks that might indicate an attack, no indication that another person had been present. Just pristine white powder extending in every direction, marked only by the single line of boot prints that led to nowhere. Search and Rescue Coordinator Thomas Hendricks had worked mountain recoveries in Colorado for 23 years. He had seen tracks that ended at cliff edges, tracks that disappeared into avalanche debris, tracks that led to frozen bodies half buried in snowdrifts. He had never seen tracks that simply stopped in the middle of a flat, open trail with no explanation. He called for a helicopter to survey the area from above, thinking Kevin might have somehow left the trail without leaving prints, might have walked on rocks or fallen timber that would not show his passage. The helicopter crew reported nothing. The snow cover was complete and unbroken in every direction. There was nowhere Kevin could have gone that would not have left tracks. They brought in dogs. The dogs followed Kevin's scent to the final footprint and then circled in confusion, unable to pick up the trail beyond that point. One handler reported that his dog had whined and refused to continue past the last track, a behavior the handler had never observed in 12 years of search work. Kevin Marsh was 31 years old, an experienced backcountry skier and mountaineer who had summited 4 of Colorado's 14ers in winter conditions. He worked as a software developer in Denver and spent most of his weekends in the mountains. He knew the Rocky Mountain National Park trail system as well as anyone, and he had hiked this particular route, the Flat-Top Mountain Trail to Hallett Peak, at least a dozen times in winter. He was not a person who got lost. He was not a person who made mistakes in the backcountry. On January 14th, 2021, he left his apartment at 4:30 in the morning, texted his girlfriend that he was heading to the park for a sunrise hike, and drove the hour and a half to the Bear Lake trailhead. His vehicle was found in the parking lot that afternoon when he failed to return for a scheduled dinner. His pack, containing food, water, extra layers, and emergency supplies, was still in the back seat. He had apparently decided to do a quick morning hike without his full gear, something his girlfriend said was unusual for him, but not unprecedented on trails he knew well. The temperature that morning was 7 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind speeds at the ridge were estimated at 15 to 20 miles per hour. Conditions were challenging, but not extreme for an experienced winter hiker. The weather did not explain what happened. Nothing explained what happened. Kevin Marsh has been missing for 4 years. His body has never been found. The search was suspended after 11 days when heavy snowfall made further operations impossible. When spring came and the snow melted, searchers returned to the area where his tracks had ended. They found nothing. No remains, no clothing, no equipment. The mountain had given up none of its secrets. The case file contains more than 200 pages of documentation. Witness interviews, search logs, weather reports, GPS data from Kevin's phone, which stopped transmitting at 6:22 that morning, approximately the time he would have reached the point where his tracks ended. The file also contains a handwritten note from Thomas Hendricks, added 3 weeks after the search was suspended. The note reads, "In 23 years, I have never seen anything like this." Tracks do not end in the middle of a trail. People do not vanish from open ground in broad daylight. Something happened to Kevin Marsh that I cannot explain and do not understand. I am not certain I want to understand it. This is not an isolated case. Every year, people disappear in winter wilderness conditions under circumstances that investigators cannot explain. Tracks that end without explanation. Bodies found in locations that searchers had already checked. Victims discovered without adequate clothing, despite freezing temperatures, having apparently removed their own jackets and boots in the final hours before death. Evidence that contradicts the timeline of events. Physical impossibilities preserved in snow. Winter adds a dimension to wilderness disappearances that does not exist in other seasons. Snow records everything. Every footstep, every movement, every interaction with the environment leaves a mark that trained searchers can read like a book. In summer, a person can vanish into forest or brush or rocky terrain without leaving traces. In winter, the snow should tell us exactly what happened, except when it does not. The cases in this investigation involve people who vanished in winter conditions, leaving behind evidence that makes no sense. Experienced outdoorsmen who made mistakes they would never make. Tracks that defy the laws of physics. Bodies that appeared in impossible locations. Survivors who remember nothing of what happened to them. And patterns that connect these cases across decades and thousands of miles, suggesting that something about winter wilderness creates conditions where normal rules do not apply. Subscribe now if you want to understand what the snow reveals about disappearances that should not be possible. Turn on notifications because the evidence we are about to present challenges everything you think you know about how people get lost and how they die in the backcountry. The cold preserves secrets. The snow records mysteries. And somewhere in the frozen wilderness, something is happening that we do not have words to explain. The second case occurred 11 years before Kevin Marsh vanished, in a different mountain range, under different circumstances, but with the same impossible evidence. Margaret Chen was a 47-year-old emergency room physician from Seattle who had been cross-country skiing in the North Cascades for more than 20 years. She was in excellent physical condition, completed marathons regularly, and had extensive wilderness first aid training beyond her medical degree. She understood hypothermia, frostbite, and cold weather emergencies better than almost anyone who entered the backcountry. On February 8, 2010, Margaret drove to the Mount Baker ski area with plans to spend the day on the groomed cross-country trails near the lodge. She signed in at the trail register at 8:15 in the morning, noting her planned route and expected return time of 3 in the afternoon. The weather was overcast but calm, with temperatures in the mid-20s and no significant wind. Conditions were ideal for cross-country skiing. Margaret didn't return by 3 o'clock. She did not return by 4 or 5 or 6. When the ski area closed at 7 and her vehicle was still in the parking lot, staff contacted the Whatcom County Sheriff's Office to report a missing skier. Search teams assembled that evening and began operations at first light the following morning. They found Margaret's ski tracks easily, following the groomed trail for approximately 4 miles before veering off onto an ungroomed route that led toward a frozen alpine lake called Iceberg Lake. This was unusual. Margaret had indicated on the trail register that she planned to stay on the groomed system. The ungroomed route was more challenging and would have added significant time to her trip. The tracks continued to Iceberg Lake and then onto the frozen surface. This was extremely unusual. Margaret was a physician who understood the dangers of ice travel. She would have known that alpine lakes can have inconsistent ice thickness, with areas of open water hidden by snow cover. Walking or skiing onto a frozen lake without proper equipment and training was exactly the kind of risk that Margaret Chen would never take. But the tracks said she did. The ski tracks crossed the lake surface for approximately 300 yards, heading toward the center. Then they stopped. The snow on the lake surface was wind-blown and crusted, showing the tracks clearly. They did not continue to the other side. They did not turn back toward shore. They simply ended, 2 parallel grooves in the snow that terminated as if Margaret had been lifted into the air. Search teams checked the ice around the final tracks. It was solid, more than 8 inches thick, easily capable of supporting a skier's weight. There were no cracks, no holes, no areas of weakness. If Margaret had fallen through the ice, there would have been evidence. There was no evidence. The ice was intact. The tracks ended. Margaret was gone. Divers were brought in 3 days later when weather conditions allowed. They searched the lake bottom under and around the area where the tracks ended. They found nothing. No body, no skis, no poles, no equipment of any kind. The water was 34 feet deep at that point and crystal clear. If Margaret had gone through the ice, she would have been visible on the bottom. She was not there. The search expanded to the surrounding terrain, operating on the theory that Margaret had somehow left the lake without leaving tracks, perhaps by walking on exposed rocks along the shoreline. No trace of her was found. Her body has never been recovered. Her case remains open and unsolved. Margaret's husband, a structural engineer named David Chen, drove from Seattle to Mount Baker every weekend for 2 months after her disappearance. He would park at the ski area, hike to Iceberg Lake, and stand at the edge of the frozen surface, looking at the spot where his wife's tracks ended. He told investigators that he kept expecting to understand what had happened, kept thinking that if he looked long enough, some explanation would present itself. It never did. In an interview with researchers 4 years after Margaret's disappearance, David described something that had not been included in the official case file. He said that on his 3rd visit to the lake, he had noticed something strange about the final section of Margaret's tracks. The grooves left by her skis had been photographed extensively during the search, and David had studied those photographs carefully. But standing at the lake in person, he saw something the photographs had not captured clearly. The tracks were backwards, not in the sense that Margaret had been skiing in reverse. The grooves were oriented in the wrong direction. Cross-country ski tracks show a characteristic pattern based on the kick and glide motion of the skier. The groove deepens at the point where the skier pushes off and becomes shallower as the ski glides forward. This pattern indicates the direction of travel. The tracks near the end of Margaret's trail showed this pattern reversed. According to the groove depth, Margaret had been traveling toward the shore, not toward the center of the lake. According to the tracks, she had been coming back when she vanished, not going out. But the tracks started at the shore and ended at the center. There were no tracks going the other direction. If Margaret had skied out to the center and then started back, there should have been 2 sets of tracks, one going out and one coming back. There was only one set, and that set showed evidence of travel in both directions simultaneously. David reported this observation to the sheriff's office. They sent an investigator to examine the tracks. By that time, nearly 3 weeks after Margaret's disappearance, weather had degraded the evidence significantly. The investigator noted David's observation, but could not confirm it independently. The detail was added to the case file as unverified. David still visits Iceberg Lake every February, on the anniversary of Margaret's disappearance. He stands at the shore and looks at the frozen surface and wonders how his wife skied out onto that ice, why her tracks ended where they did, and how those tracks could show her traveling in 2 directions at once. He has never found answers. The 3rd case introduces a pattern that appears repeatedly in winter disappearances, a pattern that researchers have found deeply troubling. Christopher Reeves was a 28-year-old wilderness guide from Jackson, Wyoming, who had worked in Grand Teton National Park for 6 seasons. He led backcountry ski tours in winter and mountaineering expeditions in summer. He had completed avalanche safety certification, wilderness first responder training, and cold weather survival courses. He knew the Teton Range better than most people know their own neighborhoods. On December 19, 2017, Christopher was leading a group of 4 clients on a day tour from the Jackson Hole Ski Resort into the backcountry areas east of the main ski runs. The group included 2 married couples from California who had booked the tour through Christopher's company, Teton Backcountry Adventures. The planned route would take them through moderate terrain with excellent powder snow, returning to the resort by mid-afternoon. The morning went smoothly. Christopher led the group through several powder runs, demonstrating technique and ensuring everyone stayed together. They stopped for lunch at a sheltered spot around noon, eating sandwiches and drinking hot chocolate from thermoses. Weather conditions were good, with temperatures in the teens and light wind. Everyone was in good spirits. At approximately 1:15, Christopher told the group he needed to ski ahead to check conditions on the next section of the route. He said he would be gone for 10 or 15 minutes and instructed the group to wait where they were until he returned. They watched him ski down a moderate slope and disappear around a stand of evergreen trees approximately 200 yards away. He did not return in 15 minutes. He did not return in 30 minutes. After an hour of waiting, one of the clients, a man named Robert Thornton, who had some backcountry experience, decided to ski down to the trees where Christopher had disappeared to see if something had gone wrong. Robert followed Christopher's tracks easily. They led down the slope, around the trees, and into a small clearing on the other side. The clearing was perhaps 50 yards across, surrounded by dense forest on 3 sides, and the slope the group had descended on the 4th. Christopher's tracks entered the clearing and continued for approximately 30 yards. Then they stopped. Robert skied to the end of the tracks and looked around. The snow in the clearing was unmarked except for Christopher's single set of tracks leading in from the slope. There were no tracks leading out. There was no sign of Christopher anywhere. Robert called out. There was no response. He skied around the perimeter of the clearing, looking for any indication of where Christopher might have gone. He found nothing. The forest around the clearing was dense, with branches low enough that skiing through it would have been difficult or impossible. And even if Christopher had somehow pushed through the trees, he would have left tracks in the snow. There were no tracks anywhere, except the single line that ended in the middle of the clearing. Robert returned to the group and reported what he had found. They waited another hour, hoping Christopher would reappear, before one of them managed to get cell service and call for help. Search and rescue teams reached their location by late afternoon. Searchers confirmed what Robert had observed. Christopher's tracks entered the clearing and stopped approximately 30 yards in. The snow showed no evidence of struggle, no blood, no disturbed areas. Christopher's poles had been planted in the snow at the end of his track, standing upright as if he had stopped for a moment and then simply ceased to exist. The poles were still there. Christopher was not. Dogs were brought in and tracked Christopher's scent to the same location where his tracks ended. Like the dogs in Kevin Marsh's case, they circled in confusion at the final point and could not pick up the scent beyond it. One handler reported that his dog had alerted at the location, a behavior typically indicating the presence of human remains, but there were no remains visible, and the snow showed no signs of burial. The search continued for 9 days. Teams covered every accessible area within 5 miles of the clearing. They found no trace of Christopher Reeves, no body, no equipment, no clothing, nothing that would explain where he had gone or what had happened to him. The case attracted significant attention because of Christopher's expertise. This was not a novice who had made a mistake in unfamiliar terrain. This was a professional guide with years of experience, on a route he had traveled dozens of times, in conditions he had encountered hundreds of times before. He had no medical conditions that might have caused a sudden collapse. He had no personal problems that might have motivated him to disappear. He had 4 clients waiting for him just 200 yards away. There was no logical reason for him to vanish, and no logical explanation for how he could have vanished without leaving tracks. The investigation explored every possibility investigators could imagine. They considered that Christopher might have been attacked by an animal, but there were no animal tracks in the clearing and no evidence of violence. They considered that he might have been buried by a sudden snowslide, but the terrain was not steep enough for avalanche activity, and there was no debris. They considered that he might have deliberately disappeared, staging the scene to escape some unknown problem in his life. But extensive background investigation revealed no motive and no evidence of planning. They were left with a set of facts that did not fit any explanation. A man skied into a clearing in broad daylight with 4 witnesses 200 yards away. His tracks stopped in the middle of the clearing. His poles were standing in the snow. He was gone, and he has never been found. Christopher's mother, a retired schoolteacher from Montana named Helen Reeves, visits the clearing every December on the anniversary of his disappearance. She has placed a small wooden cross at the spot where his tracks ended. She told researchers that she does not believe her son is dead, that she feels certain he is somewhere, that the way he vanished suggests he went somewhere rather than simply ceasing to exist. When asked where she thought he might have gone, Helen said she did not know, but she said the clearing feels different from other places in the mountains. She said there is a quality to the silence there that she has not experienced anywhere else. She said it feels like a place where the boundary between here and somewhere else is very thin. She said she hopes Christopher is happy, wherever he is. She said she hopes he is not afraid. The 4th case in Part 1 introduces evidence that is perhaps the most difficult to explain. Amanda Torres was a 39-year-old attorney from Bozeman, Montana, who disappeared during a solo snowshoe hike in Yellowstone National Park on January 7, 2019. She was an experienced winter hiker who had explored the park's backcountry for more than a decade. She knew the risks, carried appropriate gear, and had filed a detailed trip plan with the Park Service before setting out. Her planned route would take her from the Mammoth Hot Springs area south toward Bunsen Peak, a moderate day hike that she had completed several times in previous winters. She checked in with the ranger station at 7:30 in the morning and began her hike shortly after 8. A park employee saw her on the trail approximately 2 miles from the trailhead at around 9:15. She waved and smiled as she passed. That was the last confirmed sighting. When Amanda failed to return by her planned time of 4 in the afternoon, rangers initiated a search. Her vehicle was in the parking lot. Her trip plan was on file. They knew exactly where she had intended to go. They found her tracks without difficulty, following the established winter route toward Bunsen Peak. The tracks showed steady progress with occasional stops, probably to take photographs or drink water. There was nothing unusual about the track pattern for the first 3 miles. At approximately the 3-mile mark, Amanda's tracks left the established route. They veered to the east, toward an area of thermal features that hikers were prohibited from entering in winter. The thermal ground in this area was particularly unstable, with thin crusts over boiling water and unpredictable conditions that could change without warning. Amanda knew this area was off-limits. She had helped draft some of the park's winter hiking guidelines during her volunteer work with the Yellowstone Association. But her tracks went there anyway. Rangers followed the tracks carefully, staying on safe ground where possible. The trail Amanda had left wound through the thermal area, passing within feet of active hot springs and steam vents. The snow near some of these features had melted, leaving patches of bare ground and pools of hot water. Amanda's tracks navigated around these hazards with apparent precision, never coming close enough to suggest she had been burned or injured. After approximately half a mile through the thermal area, the tracks reached a feature known informally as Devil's Kitchen, a collapsed crater approximately 30 feet across that contains superheated mud and steam. The official temperature of the feature is estimated at over 200 degrees. The area around it is marked with warning signs and barriers during summer months. In winter, snow covers the signs, but the heat from the feature keeps a circle of bare ground exposed around its rim. Amanda's tracks led directly to the edge of Devil's Kitchen and stopped. Searchers examined the scene carefully. The tracks approached the crater rim and terminated approximately 2 feet from the edge. The final footprints were facing the crater, as if Amanda had stood there looking into the feature. There were no tracks leading away. There were no signs of a fall into the crater. The edge was intact, not broken or collapsed. Rangers used thermal imaging equipment to search the interior of Devil's Kitchen. The temperature readings confirmed that nothing could survive in the superheated mud. If Amanda had fallen in, she would have died instantly, and her remains would have been consumed within hours. But there was no evidence of a fall. The snow at the rim was undisturbed. Her tracks simply ended at the edge, and Amanda was gone. The official conclusion was that Amanda Torres had entered the thermal feature voluntarily, or accidentally, and died from thermal injuries. Her remains were not recoverable due to the nature of the feature. The case was closed as an accidental death, but several details did not fit this conclusion. First, Amanda's backpack was found approximately 100 yards from Devil's Kitchen, carefully placed against a tree with the hip belt buckled as if she had taken it off deliberately and set it down with care. Inside the pack were her water bottles, her food, her emergency supplies, and her satellite communication device, which she hadn't activated. If she had been confused or injured or in distress, she would have used the satellite device. She did not. Second, Amanda's jacket was found 50 yards from the pack, folded neatly on a flat rock. Her hat and gloves were placed on top of the jacket. In temperatures that were approximately 15 degrees that day, removing these items would lead to rapid heat loss and hypothermia. There was no rational reason for Amanda to take them off. Third, the tracks between the backpack location and Devil's Kitchen showed something strange. Amanda had apparently walked the 50-yard distance between the jacket and the crater multiple times. The tracks crossed over each other, creating a complex pattern that suggested she had paced back and forth repeatedly before finally approaching the rim. Search analysts counted at least 7 separate passes over approximately the same ground. Fourth, and most disturbing, one of the rangers who examined the scene reported finding a second set of tracks near Devil's Kitchen. These tracks were not made by snowshoes or boots. They were bare footprints, human feet without any covering, pressed into the snow beside Amanda's snowshoe tracks for approximately 20 yards approaching the crater. The ranger photographed the prints and included them in his report. When investigators reviewed the photographs, they found that the bare footprints matched Amanda Torres's foot size exactly. The prints had been made by Amanda herself. She had apparently removed her snowshoes and walked barefoot through the snow in 15-degree weather before reaching the edge of Devil's Kitchen. No one could explain why she would do this. No one could explain any of her behavior in the final hour of her life. She had left the safe trail. She had navigated through a dangerous thermal area. She had removed her pack, her jacket, her gloves, her hat, and finally, her snowshoes. She had walked barefoot through the snow. She had paced back and forth near the crater. And then she had gone to the edge and vanished. The case file contains a note from the lead investigator, a veteran ranger named Samuel Richardson, who had worked Yellowstone's backcountry for 18 years. The note reads, "I have investigated thermal feature deaths before. They are accidents. They are tragedies. They make sense as failures of judgment or attention. This case does not make sense. Amanda Torres did not make a mistake. She did something deliberately, something that required her to remove her protection from the cold and approach a feature she knew was deadly. I do not know what she was doing. I do not know why she did it. And I do not know where she went because she did not fall into that crater. The evidence does not support that conclusion. She went somewhere else. I do not know where. 4 cases from 4 different locations across the American West. A hiker whose tracks ended in the middle of a flat trail. A skier whose tracks stopped on a frozen lake, showing evidence of travel in 2 directions at once. A professional guide who vanished from a clearing while 4 clients waited nearby. A woman who removed her clothing in freezing temperatures and walked barefoot to the edge of a superheated crater. The evidence in each case was preserved by snow. Every footstep was recorded. Every movement was documented by the simple fact of weight pressing into frozen precipitation. Winter wilderness is the best possible environment for reconstructing what happened to a missing person. The snow tells the story. Except these stories do not make sense. The tracks end without explanation. The evidence contradicts itself. The victims behave in ways that defy rational understanding, and the bodies, in most cases, are never found. Researchers who study unexplained disappearances have identified winter cases as a distinct category with characteristics that do not appear in other seasons. The snow preserves evidence that would be lost in summer. That evidence reveals patterns that investigators cannot explain. Tracks that stop, tracks that reverse direction, victims who remove protective clothing, bodies that appear in locations that were already searched, and a geographic clustering that suggests certain areas produce more of these impossible cases than random chance would predict. Part 2 of this investigation will examine cases where victims were found, but the circumstances of their discovery raised more questions than they answered. Bodies without tracks around them, as if they had fallen from the sky. Victims discovered in locations searchers had checked multiple times before. People who survived their ordeals but remember nothing of what happened to them. The evidence in these 4 cases follows the same pattern. Tracks that end without explanation. Victims who behaved in ways that contradict their experience and training. Physical impossibilities preserved in snow, and no bodies recovered to provide answers. Subscribe now and turn on notifications. Part 2 is coming, and the evidence becomes stranger. We have tracks that end. Now we will see what happens when the tracks are missing entirely. The winter wilderness holds answers we have not found yet. The people who vanished there deserve to be remembered, and the patterns that connect their cases deserve attention, even if they cannot be explained. The body was lying in the middle of the clearing when the search team arrived at 7:45 in the morning. It was face down in the snow, arms extended overhead as if reaching for something, wearing only a thermal undershirt and jeans. No jacket, no hat, no gloves, no boots. The bare feet were visible against the white powder, the skin waxy and pale with the unmistakable appearance of severe frostbite. The search coordinator, a woman named Jennifer Walsh, who had led mountain rescue operations in Vermont for 16 years, stopped at the edge of the clearing and stared. She did not immediately approach the body. She was looking at the snow around it. The snow was pristine, unmarked. undisturbed in any direction for at least 50 yards. There were no tracks leading to the body. There were no tracks leading away from the body. There were no tracks anywhere in the clearing except the ones the search team had just made, approaching from the tree line. The body was simply there, lying in fresh powder that showed no evidence of how it had arrived. Jennifer radioed base camp and requested that no one else enter the clearing until she had documented the scene. She took photographs from multiple angles, capturing the body's position, the surrounding snow, and the complete absence of any tracks or disturbance. She measured the distance from the tree line to the body, 53 yards. She checked the snow depth, 14 inches of fresh powder over a harder base layer, fallen during the storm that had ended 18 hours earlier. The math did not work. If someone had carried the body into the clearing, there would be tracks. If the victim had walked there himself, there would be tracks. If he had been dropped from a helicopter or airplane, there would be impact marks, disturbed snow, some indication of the force of landing. There was nothing. The powder around the body was as smooth and undisturbed as the powder at the edges of the clearing. The victim was identified as Marcus Webb, a 33-year-old accountant from Burlington who had gone missing 4 days earlier during a solo backcountry skiing trip in the Green Mountains. His car had been found at a trailhead 12 miles from where his body now lay. Search teams had been looking for him since the morning after he failed to return home. They had covered hundreds of square miles of terrain. They had searched this exact clearing twice before, most recently the previous afternoon, approximately 20 hours before Jennifer Walsh and her team found the body. The clearing had been empty then. Jennifer had the GPS logs to prove it. Her team had walked through this exact location at 3:22 in the afternoon on the 4th day of the search. They had seen nothing. There had been no body. There had been no tracks. 18 hours later, Marcus Webb was lying in the snow as if he had always been there, surrounded by 14 inches of powder that showed no sign of how he had arrived. The medical examiner determined that Marcus had died of hypothermia, probably within 12 to 24 hours of when his body was found. The timeline meant he had been alive for at least 3 days after his disappearance. Where he had been during those 3 days, and how he had ended up in the clearing without leaving tracks, could not be determined. The medical examiner also noted something unusual about the body. Marcus's core temperature at the time of examination was lower than expected for someone who had died of hypothermia in the conditions present at the scene. Hypothermia victims typically show core temperatures between 70 and 80 degrees at death. Marcus's core temperature was 51 degrees, cold enough that the examiner initially suspected he had been dead much longer than the evidence suggested. Further analysis confirmed the original timeline. Marcus had died recently. His body was simply much colder than it should have been. The case file contains interviews with Marcus's family and friends, all of whom confirmed that he was an experienced backcountry skier who would never have removed his protective clothing in freezing temperatures. His jacket, boots, hat, and gloves were never found. Neither were his skis or poles. He had vanished with full equipment and appeared 4 days later with almost nothing, in a location 12 miles from where he had started, with no explanation for how he had gotten there. Jennifer Walsh retired from search and rescue work 8 months after finding Marcus Webb's body. In her final interview with researchers, she said she had lost confidence in her ability to understand what happens to people in the winter wilderness. She said finding a body with no tracks around it violated everything she knew about how evidence works in snow. She said she had replayed the scene in her mind hundreds of times, trying to find an explanation that made sense. She never found one. Part 1 of this investigation examined cases where tracks ended without explanation. Victims who walked into the wilderness and simply stopped leaving footprints as if they had ceased to exist mid-stride. Kevin Marsh on a Colorado ridge, Margaret Chen on a frozen lake, Christopher Reeves in a forest clearing, Amanda Torres at the edge of a thermal feature. All of them left tracks that told part of a story, but not the ending. Part 2 examines a different phenomenon. Cases where the tracks are not incomplete, but entirely absent. Bodies that appear in locations with no evidence of how they arrived. Victims discovered in places that searchers had already checked, sometimes multiple times. And survivors who walked out of the wilderness with no memory of what happened to them, days or weeks after they should have died. The snow preserves evidence. That is the fundamental principle of winter search and rescue. Every step leaves a mark. Every movement creates a record. The cold slows decomposition. The white surface shows contrast. Winter should make it easier to find missing persons and to understand what happened to them. But the cases in this investigation suggest that winter wilderness contains something that defies this logic. Something that moves people without leaving tracks. Something that hides them from searchers and then reveals them in impossible locations. Something that takes their memories along with their lives. Subscribe now if you watched Part 1 and want to understand how these cases connect to what we examined there. Turn on notifications because the evidence in Part 2 is different from tracks that end. This is evidence that should exist and does not. These are bodies that should not be where they are. These are survivors who should be dead and cannot explain why they are not. The second case in Part 2 occurred in Minnesota, in a state forest that has produced more unexplained winter disappearances per square mile than almost any other location in the continental United States. The Superior National Forest covers more than 3 million acres along the Canadian border. In winter, temperatures regularly drop below -20 degrees. Wind chills can reach -50 or colder. The terrain is a maze of frozen lakes, dense boreal forest, and rocky outcroppings that all look identical under snow cover. It is one of the most dangerous winter environments in North America, and it has been taking people for as long as records have been kept. Daniel Kowalski was a 41-year-old high school biology teacher from Duluth who disappeared on February 2, 2015, during a weekend ice fishing trip with 2 friends. The 3 men had driven to a cabin on Birch Lake, about 60 miles north of the city, planning to spend 2 days fishing and relaxing. They arrived Friday evening, set up their gear, and went to bed early in anticipation of an early start the next morning. When Daniel's friends woke up Saturday morning, Daniel was gone. His boots were by the door. His jacket was hanging on its hook. His hat and gloves were on the shelf where he had left them the night before. His phone was on the nightstand beside his bed. He had apparently walked out of the cabin in the middle of the night, wearing only the thermal underwear and wool socks he had been sleeping in. The temperature outside was -17 degrees. Without protective clothing, a person would begin experiencing hypothermia within minutes. Frostbite would set in on exposed skin almost immediately. Death would follow within an hour or 2 at most. Daniel's friends searched the immediate area around the cabin. The snow showed their own tracks from the previous evening, leading from the car to the cabin door. There were no other tracks. Daniel had not walked out the front door. The back door was snowed shut and had not been opened. The windows were all closed and locked from the inside. Daniel Kowalski had vanished from a locked cabin without leaving any tracks in the snow. Search and rescue teams arrived within hours. They expanded the search area systematically, checking the lake surface, the surrounding forest, and the access road for any sign of Daniel. They found nothing. No tracks, no clothing, no evidence that he had ever left the cabin. The dogs were confused by the scene, picking up Daniel's scent strongly inside the cabin, but unable to find any trail leading away from it. The search continued for 6 days before being suspended due to a severe winter storm. When conditions improved and teams returned to the area, they focused on the possibility that Daniel's body might be somewhere that snow had obscured during the initial search. They brought in additional dogs, ground-penetrating radar equipment, and a helicopter with thermal imaging capability. On the 11th day of the search, a team checking the shoreline of a small lake approximately 4 miles from the cabin found Daniel Kowalski's body. He was sitting upright against a large pine tree, his legs extended in front of him, his hands resting on his thighs. His eyes were open. His face showed an expression that searchers later described as peaceful, almost content. He was still wearing only his thermal underwear and wool socks. He appeared to have sat down against the tree and simply stopped living. The snow around the tree showed no tracks. The searchers who found him had to break trail through waist-deep powder to reach the location. The nearest established trail was more than a mile away. There was no path, no disturbance, no indication of how Daniel had traveled 4 miles through deep snow in sub-zero temperatures, wearing only his underwear. The medical examiner confirmed death by hypothermia. The timeline was difficult to establish precisely, but evidence suggested Daniel had been dead for at least a week, meaning he had died within days of his disappearance. The 4-mile distance from the cabin should have been impossible to cover in his condition and clothing. The complete absence of tracks was inexplicable. There was one additional detail that investigators found troubling. Daniel's thermal underwear showed no damage, consistent with walking 4 miles through dense forest. No tears, no snags, no accumulated snow or ice. The wool socks on his feet were clean, showing none of the wear or moisture that would result from a miles-long trek through deep powder. It was as if Daniel had been transported to the location where he was found, rather than walking there himself. Daniel's friends were interviewed extensively. Both passed polygraph examinations. Neither had any motive to harm Daniel, and the physical evidence made it clear they could not have carried his body 4 miles through trackless wilderness without leaving any trace. The investigation found no evidence of foul play. It also found no explanation for what had happened. The case file contains a note from one of the search coordinators, a retired Forest Service ranger named William Crawford, who had participated in dozens of winter searches over a 30-year career. The note reads, "I have seen people do strange things in hypothermia. I have seen paradoxical undressing. I have seen terminal burrowing. I have seen victims walk miles in conditions that should have killed them. But I have never seen anyone travel 4 miles through deep snow without leaving tracks. I have never seen anyone sit down against a tree in sub-zero temperatures and die peacefully without any sign of struggle or distress." Daniel Kowalski did not walk to that tree. Something else happened. I do not know what. The third case in Part 2 involves a survivor, one of the rare individuals who experienced whatever happens in winter wilderness disappearances and lived to tell about it. Except, she cannot tell about it. Because she does not remember. Rachel Morrison was a 26-year-old graduate student in environmental science at the University of Montana, who disappeared during a research trip to Glacier National Park on January 19, 2020. She was collecting snow samples for a study on atmospheric pollutant deposition, work that required her to travel into the backcountry to locations far from roads or developed areas. She had completed similar trips dozens of times during her 3 years in the program. On the morning of January 19th, Rachel checked in with her faculty advisor, confirmed her planned route and return time, and drove to the trailhead at the Two Medicine area on the east side of the park. She signed the trail register at 8:45, indicating her destination, and expected return by 4 in the afternoon. Weather conditions were clear and cold, with temperatures around 10 degrees and light wind. Perfect conditions for backcountry travel. Rachel did not return by 4 o'clock. She did not return by nightfall. When she failed to answer her phone or respond to text messages, her advisor contacted Park Dispatch to report her overdue. Search operations began the following morning. Rangers found Rachel's car at the trailhead, her trail register entry confirming her planned route, and her tracks in the snow leading up the trail toward her research sites. The tracks were clear and consistent for approximately 3 miles, showing the steady progress of an experienced winter traveler. At the 3-mile mark, the tracks ended. Searchers recognized the pattern immediately. Like Kevin Marsh, like Christopher Reeves, Rachel's footprints simply stopped in the middle of the trail. There was no indication of where she had gone or what had happened. The snow was undisturbed in every direction. Her tracks led to a point approximately 10 feet past a trail marker and then ceased to exist. The search continued for 12 days. Teams covered every accessible area of the park's east side, checking trails, ridges, drainages, and frozen lakes. They found no additional sign of Rachel. Her tracks ended at that point on the trail, and there was no other evidence anywhere. On the 13th day, a family driving through the park on the Going to the Sun road stopped at a pullout to take photographs. Their 8-year-old daughter noticed something moving in the trees approximately 50 yards from the road. When her parents looked, they saw a woman walking through the deep snow between the trees, moving slowly but steadily toward the road. The woman was Rachel Morrison. She was wearing her winter hiking clothes, her pack, her hat, and her gloves. She appeared disoriented, but physically unharmed. When the family reached her and asked if she was okay, she did not respond. She kept walking toward the road, her eyes unfocused, her movements mechanical. She did not seem to recognize that people were speaking to her. The family called 911. Rangers arrived within 20 minutes and confirmed Rachel's identity. She was transported to the nearest hospital, where doctors examined her for hypothermia, frostbite, and dehydration. They found none of these conditions. Despite spending 13 days in winter wilderness in temperatures that regularly dropped below zero, Rachel showed no signs of cold exposure. Her core temperature was normal, her extremities were undamaged, her hydration levels were within normal range. She had no memory of the previous 13 days. Rachel's last clear memory was hiking up the trail toward her research sites on the morning of January 19th. She remembered the weather, the snow conditions, the view of the mountains. She remembered reaching a trail marker approximately 3 miles from the trailhead. She remembered nothing after that. The next thing she knew, she was walking through trees near a road, and strangers were asking if she was okay. 13 days had passed. Rachel could not account for any of them. She did not know where she had been, what she had done, how she had survived without food or water or shelter. Her pack still contained the food she had brought for her day trip, untouched. Her water bottles were full. Her emergency supplies had not been used. Nothing indicated how she had lived for nearly 2 weeks in conditions that should have killed her within days. Psychological evaluation found no evidence of dissociative disorder, amnesia from head trauma, or other conditions that might explain the memory loss. Brain scans were normal. Blood tests showed nothing unusual. Rachel was physically and mentally healthy. She simply had no memory of 13 days of her life. Investigators attempted to reconstruct her movements during the missing period. The location where she was found was approximately 18 miles from where her tracks had ended. The terrain between those 2 points was rugged, much of it above tree line, exposed to wind and cold that would have been fatal to an unprotected person. There was no logical route she could have taken. There was no explanation for how she had survived. Rachel returned to her graduate program after several weeks of recovery, but she has never been able to resume her backcountry research. She told interviewers that being in the winter wilderness now triggers intense anxiety, a feeling of wrongness that she cannot explain. She said she feels like something happened to her during those 13 days, something important, something that changed her. But she cannot remember what it was. She said the not knowing is worse than any memory could be. In a final interview with researchers 2 years after her experience, Rachel described something she had not mentioned to investigators at the time. She said that since her return, she has had recurring dreams about the missing period. The dreams are fragmentary and unclear, but certain elements repeat consistently. She dreams of being underground, not in a cave, but in some kind of space beneath the snow, a hollow area where the cold does not reach. She dreams of being warm there, comfortable, protected from the wind and the ice above. She dreams of not being alone. She cannot see what is with her in these dreams. She can only sense a presence, something large and patient that seems to be waiting. She does not feel afraid in the dreams. She feels safe. She feels like she is exactly where she is supposed to be. When she wakes, she feels an intense longing to go back, to find the hollow space again, to be with whatever was waiting there. She said she does not trust these feelings. She said she believes something happened to her, that her conscious mind is not allowed to remember. She said the dreams might be fragments of that experience leaking through, or they might be something else entirely, something that was put in her head during the missing time. She said she will never go into the winter wilderness again. She said she is afraid of what she might remember. She said she is more afraid of what might be waiting for her. The fourth case in Part 2 demonstrates the most extreme version of the phenomenon. A body that appeared in a location that was not merely searched, but occupied continuously by witnesses who saw nothing until the body was suddenly there. The incident occurred on March 3, 2016, at a ski resort in Utah called Brighton, located in Big Cottonwood Canyon, approximately 30 miles from Salt Lake City. The resort was operating normally that day, with thousands of skiers and snowboarders on the mountain. Weather conditions were excellent, with fresh powder and clear skies. At approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, a group of 4 friends were riding the Great Western Chairlift toward the top of the mountain. The lift carries passengers over a run called Sunshine, a moderate blue slope that was busy with skiers that day. The 4 friends, all experienced skiers in their 20s, were talking and laughing as the chair climbed the mountain, One of them, a woman named Catherine Novak, looked down at the slope below and stopped mid-sentence. There was a body in the snow approximately 60 feet below the chairlift. It was lying face up, arms outstretched, wearing what appeared to be ski clothing. It was not moving. Skiers were passing on either side of it, some within a few yards, apparently not noticing it. Catherine told her friends to look. They all saw it. A person lying motionless in the snow in the middle of an active ski run, while other skiers went past as if nothing was there. Catherine began shouting and waving, trying to get the attention of skiers below. No one responded. No one seemed to see the body or hear her shouting. The chairlift continued to climb, carrying the four friends away from the scene. When they reached the top, Catherine immediately reported what she had seen to a lift operator. She described the location precisely, identifying the spot by its relation to visible landmarks. The lift operator radioed ski patrol. Patrol responded within minutes. They skied to the location Catherine had described. They found nothing. The snow on the run was tracked with ski marks, but showed no body, no disturbance, no indication that anyone had fallen or stopped there. Catherine insisted on what she had seen. Her three friends confirmed it. All four had observed a body lying in the snow for approximately 30 seconds as their chair passed over the location. They described the position, the clothing, the fact that other skiers seemed unaware of it. Patrol searched the area more thoroughly. They checked the trees on either side of the run. They looked for tracks leading off the groomed surface. They found nothing. Catherine was upset, but had no explanation. She and her friends completed their ski day, though Catherine said later that she could not stop thinking about what she had seen. She was certain it had been real. She was certain it had been a person lying motionless in the snow. At 4:15 that afternoon, approximately 2 hours after Catherine's sighting, a ski patroller conducting a routine sweep of the mountain before closing found a body on the Sunshine Run. It was lying face up, arms outstretched, wearing ski clothing. It was in the exact location Catherine had described. It was approximately 60 feet below the Great Western Chairlift. The victim was identified as Brian Patterson, a 37-year-old real estate agent from Salt Lake City who had been reported missing from the resort earlier that day. According to witness statements, Brian had been skiing with friends around 11 that morning when he separated from the group during a run. His friends assumed he had simply taken a different route and would meet them at the lodge. When he failed to appear, they searched for him and eventually reported him missing to ski patrol. The search for Brian had been ongoing throughout the afternoon. Patrol had covered every open run on the mountain multiple times. They had skied past the location where his body was eventually found on at least 6 separate occasions. They had seen nothing. Catherine Novak and her friends had ridden the Great Western Chairlift at 2:30 and seen a body. Patrol had checked the location at 2:45, approximately 15 minutes later. No body. Other patrol members had skied the run at 3:10, 3:25, and 3:50. No body. At 4:15, the body was there. The medical examiner determined that Brian had died of trauma consistent with a high-speed skiing collision with a stationary object, probably a tree. The injuries were severe and would have caused death almost instantly. The time of death was estimated at between 10 and 11 that morning, approximately 5 to 6 hours before his body was found. This created a problem. If Brian had died around 11 that morning, his body should have been on the mountain all day. The run where he was found had been skied by hundreds of people over those 5 hours. Patrol had checked the area repeatedly. 4 witnesses on a chairlift had seen a body at 2:30, but patrol found nothing 15 minutes later. Then, at 4:15, the body was there as if it had always been there. The investigation could not explain the timeline. Either Brian's body had been somewhere else for 5 hours before appearing on the run, or it had been there all along and somehow remained invisible to everyone except the 4 witnesses on the chairlift. Neither explanation made sense. Catherine Novak was interviewed multiple times. She remained consistent in her account. She had seen a body at 2:30 in exactly the location where Brian Patterson was eventually found. She had not imagined it. Her 3 friends confirmed her account completely. When asked how she reconciled what she saw with the patrol's failure to find anything 15 minutes later, Catherine said she could not reconcile it. She said what she saw was real. She said Brian Patterson's body was lying in the snow at 2:30, and skiers were going past it without reacting, as if they could not see it. She said whatever was happening on that mountain that day, it did not follow normal rules. The case file contains a note from the resort's director of ski patrol, a man named Robert Vasquez, who had worked mountain safety for 22 years. The note reads, "I have investigated dozens of fatalities during my career. Bodies do not appear and disappear. Bodies do not become invisible to trained patrollers and then suddenly visible hours later. I cannot explain what happened with Brian Patterson. I can only document that it happened." 4 witnesses saw his body hours before we found it, in a location we checked multiple times. Either they saw something we could not see, or the body was not there when we looked and appeared later. I do not know which possibility is more disturbing. 4 cases where the normal rules of evidence do not apply. Marcus Webb, found in a clearing with no tracks around him, in a location searchers had checked 20 hours earlier. Daniel Kowalski, discovered 4 miles from where he vanished, with no trail through the deep snow between. Rachel Morrison, who survived 13 days in lethal conditions with no memory and no physical effects. Brian Patterson, whose body appeared on a ski slope hours after it should have been visible, seen by witnesses, but invisible to rescue teams. Part 1, documented tracks that end without explanation. Part 2 documents bodies that appear without tracks. The phenomena are different, but connected. In winter wilderness, the snow should record everything. Instead, it records impossibilities. The cases share characteristics that researchers find significant. All involve victims who were experienced in winter conditions. All involve evidence that contradicts basic physics. All involve bodies or survivors found in locations that had already been searched. And all involve gaps in time, periods where the victim was somewhere that cannot be determined, doing something that cannot be explained. The survivors, in the rare cases where they exist, remember nothing. The dead leave no explanation. The snow that should tell us everything tells us only that something impossible has occurred. Part 3 will examine the patterns that connect these cases across decades and geography. We will look at the locations where these disappearances cluster, the characteristics of the victims who are taken, and the evidence that suggests winter wilderness may contain something that actively interferes with search and rescue operations. The cases in Parts 1 and 2 are individual tragedies. The patterns we will examine in Part 3 suggest something larger, something that has been happening for a very long time, something that may still be happening whenever the snow falls and the temperature drops, and people venture into the frozen wilderness. Subscribe now and turn on notifications. Part 3 is coming, and what we present there may explain why these cases occur, or it may raise questions that have no answers. The snow continues to fall. The winter wilderness continues to take people. And somewhere in the cold and the silence, something continues to operate by rules we do not understand. Part 3 will examine the geographic clusters where these cases concentrate, the characteristics that make certain people more likely to be taken, and the timing patterns that may allow prediction of when disappearances will occur. The evidence from Parts 1 and 2 raises questions. The patterns in Part 3 suggest those questions have been asked before, by people who lived in these mountains long before modern search and rescue teams existed. Subscribe now and turn on notifications. Part 3 is coming, and the snow keeps its secrets. The map on David Paulides' wall contained 412 pins. Each pin represented a winter disappearance that met his criteria for inclusion in the cluster data. Experienced outdoorsmen who vanished without explanation, bodies found in previously searched locations, tracks that ended mid-stride, survivors with no memory of their ordeals, cases spanning 7 decades and 23 states. When Paulides stepped back and looked at the map as a whole, the pins were not distributed randomly. They clustered. Dense concentrations appeared in specific geographic areas, while vast stretches of wilderness remained almost empty. Some national forests showed dozens of pins. Others, with similar terrain and visitor numbers, showed none. The clustering could not be explained by population density, terrain difficulty, or search and rescue capability. Areas with excellent rescue teams and easy access showed the same patterns as remote wilderness with minimal support. The pins clustered where they clustered, and no conventional explanation accounted for the distribution. Paulides had spent 15 years documenting these cases before he noticed something else about the clusters. They were not static. When he compared his data year by year, the concentrations shifted. An area that produced multiple unexplained cases in one decade might go quiet for years, while a previously quiet area suddenly began generating impossible disappearances. The clusters moved, not randomly, not in any pattern Paulides could identify with certainty, but they moved, as if whatever caused these disappearances operated in certain locations for a time, and then relocated to others. This observation has never been published in any official capacity. Paulides shared it with a small group of researchers who study unexplained wilderness disappearances, and they've been tracking the movement of clusters ever since. What they have found does not fit any conventional understanding of how people get lost or die in the backcountry. The cases in parts 1 and 2 of this investigation documented individual disappearances, tracks that ended without explanation, bodies that appeared in impossible locations, survivors with no memory of their ordeals. Each case was strange in isolation. Taken together, they suggest something systematic is occurring in winter wilderness, something that has been operating for decades or longer, something that follows patterns we are only beginning to identify. Part 3 examines those patterns: the geographic clustering of cases, the characteristics shared by victims, the timing of disappearances within weather cycles, the evidence that suggests search and rescue operations may be actively interfered with by whatever is taking these people. The evidence does not explain what is happening. The evidence only documents that something is happening, something that violates the laws of physics, something that has been taking people from winter wilderness for as long as records exist. Subscribe now if you watched parts 1 and 2 and want to understand how these cases connect. Turn on notifications because the patterns we document in part 3 have never been presented publicly before. The individual cases are tragedies. The patterns suggest something larger, something that may explain why certain people are taken and others are not. Something that may explain why certain locations produce case after case while others remain quiet. The first pattern researchers identified involves the victims themselves. Not everyone who enters winter wilderness is equally likely to experience an unexplained disappearance. The cases cluster not only geographically, but demographically. Certain types of people are overrepresented in the data. Others are almost entirely absent. The most striking characteristic is expertise. Victims of unexplained winter disappearances are far more likely to be experienced outdoorsmen than novices. Kevin Marsh had summited 14ers in winter conditions. Margaret Chen had been cross-country skiing for 20 years. Christopher Reeves was a professional guide. Amanda Torres had helped write wilderness safety guidelines. Daniel Kowalski was an experienced ice fisherman. Rachel Morrison was a trained field researcher. These were not people who made beginner mistakes. These were people who understood winter wilderness, respected its dangers, and took appropriate precautions. They vanished anyway. Analysis of 247 cases meeting Paulides' criteria found that 71% of victims had significant outdoor experience. Only 12% were true novices with minimal backcountry exposure. The remaining 17% had moderate experience. This distribution is the opposite of what would be expected if the disappearances were caused by inexperience or poor judgment. Novices should be more likely to get lost, more likely to make fatal mistakes, more likely to end up in unexplained situations. Instead, the data shows that experienced outdoorsmen are approximately 6 times more likely to experience an unexplained disappearance than novices. Researchers have proposed various explanations for this pattern. Perhaps experienced people venture into more remote and dangerous terrain. Perhaps they are more likely to travel alone. Perhaps their confidence leads them to take risks that novices would avoid. None of these explanations fit the evidence. Many of the cases involve experienced people on familiar routes in moderate conditions. Christopher Reeves was on a trail he had traveled dozens of times. Margaret Chen was on a groomed cross-country route. Kevin Marsh was on a trail he had hiked repeatedly in winter. These were not people pushing into unknown territory or taking unusual risks. A second demographic pattern involves physical fitness. Victims of unexplained disappearances are significantly more likely to be in excellent physical condition than the general population of backcountry users. Marathon runners, competitive athletes, people who maintained rigorous fitness regimens are heavily overrepresented. Weekend hikers with average fitness levels are underrepresented. Again, this is the opposite of what would be expected. Less fit individuals should be more vulnerable to exhaustion, hypothermia, and poor decision-making under stress. Instead, the fittest people seem to be selected for unexplained disappearances. A third pattern involves Germanic or Scandinavian ancestry. This finding is controversial, and researchers disagree about its significance. But the data shows a statistical overrepresentation of victims with Northern European heritage. The reason for this correlation, if it is real and not an artifact of the data, is unknown. A fourth pattern involves mental state in the hours before disappearance. In cases where witnesses observed the victim before they vanished, a consistent theme emerges. The victim seemed distracted, preoccupied, as if thinking about something else. Friends of Daniel Kowalski said he had been quiet and withdrawn the evening before he vanished from that locked cabin. Colleagues of Rachel Morrison noted she had seemed distant during her final days in the office before her 13-day disappearance. Robert Thornton, one of the clients who watched Christopher Reeves ski into that clearing and never return, told investigators that Christopher had seemed unusually pensive that morning, pausing several times to look at the mountains as if seeing them for the first time. This pattern is difficult to interpret. Perhaps the victim sensed something was about to happen. Perhaps whatever takes them begins its influence before the physical disappearance. Perhaps it is coincidence, the kind of retrospective observation that people make when trying to understand a tragedy. But the pattern appears consistently enough that researchers have begun to consider it significant. Something may change in the days or hours before an unexplained disappearance. Something that affects the victim's mental state. Something that prepares them for what is coming. The second major pattern involves geography. The clusters of disappearances are not distributed according to any logic that researchers have been able to identify. They do not correlate with elevation, latitude, vegetation type, wildlife population, or any other environmental variable. They do not correlate with visitor numbers, rescue team capability, or cell phone coverage. They appear where they appear, and they move over time. Current analysis identifies 7 primary clusters in the continental United States, where unexplained winter disappearances concentrate. The first cluster covers portions of the Rocky Mountains in Colorado, centered on Rocky Mountain National Park and the surrounding wilderness areas. This cluster has produced at least 47 cases meeting research criteria since 1970. Kevin Marsh vanished here on January 14, 2021. The second cluster covers the North Cascades region of Washington state, extending into the northern portions of the Central Cascades. This cluster has produced 39 documented cases. Margaret Chen disappeared here on February 8, 2010, her ski tracks ending on Iceberg Lake, showing evidence of travel in 2 directions simultaneously. The third cluster covers the Superior National Forest in Minnesota and adjacent areas of the Boundary Waters region. This cluster has produced 34 cases. Daniel Kowalski vanished from his locked cabin here on February 2, 2015, found 11 days later 4 miles away, with no trail through the deep snow. The fourth cluster covers portions of Yellowstone National Park and the surrounding national forests in Wyoming and Montana. This cluster has produced 28 cases. Amanda Torres disappeared here on January 7, 2019, after removing her clothing in 15-degree weather and walking barefoot to the edge of Devil's Kitchen. The fifth cluster covers the Green Mountains of Vermont and adjacent areas of New Hampshire's White Mountains. This cluster has produced 23 cases. Marcus Webb's body appeared here in a clearing that had been searched 20 hours earlier, surrounded by 14 inches of undisturbed powder. The sixth cluster covers the high Sierra Nevada of California, concentrated in areas between Yosemite and Kings Canyon. This cluster has produced 19 cases. The seventh cluster covers portions of the Adirondack Mountains in New York State. This cluster has produced 17 cases. These 7 areas account for approximately 70% of all unexplained winter disappearances documented by researchers. The remaining 30% are scattered across other locations, with no area showing more than 5 cases. Why these 7 areas? The question has occupied researchers for years without producing a satisfactory answer. The clusters share some characteristics. All are mountainous or heavily forested. All experience significant winter snowfall. All have histories of human habitation extending back thousands of years, with indigenous peoples living in or near these areas before European contact. All contain wilderness, designated under the Wilderness Act of 1964, meaning motorized vehicles and permanent structures are prohibited. But many other areas share these characteristics without producing clusters of unexplained disappearances. The Bitterroot Range of Montana and Idaho meets all the criteria, but has produced only 3 documented cases. The Sawtooth Wilderness of Idaho is similar in every measurable respect to areas with heavy clustering, but shows almost no unexplained activity. The Uinta Mountains of Utah, the Bighorn Mountains of Wyoming, the Sangre de Cristo Range of New Mexico, all have extensive winter wilderness use and minimal unexplained disappearances. Something makes certain areas different. Researchers have not identified what that something is. The movement of clusters adds another layer of complexity. Data from the 1970s shows heavy activity in areas that are now quiet. Data from the 2010s shows activity in areas that were quiet in previous decades. The shifts do not occur suddenly. Activity in an area typically builds over several years, produces a concentration of cases, and then gradually diminishes as activity increases elsewhere. One researcher compared this pattern to the behavior of a predator moving through its range, exploiting one area until conditions change, and then relocating to another. This is a metaphor, not an explanation. But the pattern is consistent with something that operates in winter wilderness with intention and purpose, something that is not randomly distributed, but actively chooses where to focus its attention. The third pattern involves timing. Unexplained winter disappearances do not occur uniformly throughout the cold months. They cluster in time as well as space, concentrated during specific weather conditions and phases of winter. The highest concentration of cases occurs during the 72 hours following significant snowfall. When 6 or more inches of new snow falls in a cluster area, the probability of an unexplained disappearance increases by a factor of approximately 4 compared to periods with stable snow conditions. Researchers initially assumed this pattern reflected the obvious. Fresh snow makes travel more difficult, increases avalanche danger, and creates conditions where people are more likely to get into trouble. But the cases that occur during post-snowfall periods are not avalanche deaths or exhaustion cases. They are the impossible cases, tracks that end, bodies without trails, survivors with no memory. The strange cases concentrate during the strange weather windows. A second timing pattern involves temperature inversions, when cold air pools in valleys while warmer air sits above, creating stable atmospheric conditions with fog or low clouds. Unexplained disappearances become more frequent. These inversions typically occur during calm, clear weather following storms. They are often beautiful periods in the mountains, with dramatic lighting and peaceful conditions. They are also when people vanish. A third timing pattern involves the full moon and the days immediately surrounding it. Cases are approximately twice as likely to occur within 3 days of a full moon than during other lunar phases. This correlation is statistically significant, but has no obvious explanation. The additional light from a full moon should make winter travel safer, not more dangerous. But the data shows the opposite. Researchers have attempted to combine these timing factors into a predictive model. When fresh snow, temperature inversion, and full moon coincide in an active cluster area, the probability of an unexplained disappearance increases dramatically. During the handful of days each winter, when all 3 factors align in high-activity clusters, historical data suggests the probability of a strange case approaches certainty. Kevin Marsh disappeared on January 14, 2021. 8 inches of fresh snow had fallen overnight. A temperature inversion had settled over the Front Range the previous evening. The moon had been full 2 days earlier. All 3 factors were present. Christopher Reeves vanished on December 19, 2017. 3 days after 14 inches of new snow. The Teton Valley was experiencing a temperature inversion that morning. The full moon was the following night. Amanda Torres walked barefoot to Devil's Kitchen on January 7, 2019. 6 inches of snow had fallen the previous day. Yellowstone was under a strong temperature inversion. The moon was 2 days past full. The pattern repeats across case after case. Not every disappearance occurs during high-probability windows, but when all 3 factors align in a cluster zone, disappearances are nearly inevitable. This predictive capability has never been tested formally. Researchers lack the resources to position observers in cluster areas during high-probability windows, and the ethical implications of attempting to observe or prevent disappearances that may involve phenomena outside normal understanding are complex enough that no institution has been willing to sponsor such research. The timing patterns raise questions that researchers cannot answer. If the patterns are real, they suggest that whatever takes people from winter wilderness operates according to rules. It prefers certain conditions. It responds to environmental factors in predictable ways. This is not the behavior of random accidents or human error. This is the behavior of something systematic, something that operates in winter wilderness with purpose and preference. The 4th pattern is the most disturbing. It involves evidence that search and rescue operations may be actively interfered with. The cases documented in Parts 1 and 2 share a characteristic that appears repeatedly in the data. Bodies are found in locations that had already been searched, sometimes multiple times, sometimes with certainty that the area was clear. Brian Patterson's body appeared on a ski slope that had been checked 6 times in the hours before it was found. Marcus Webb's body appeared in a clearing that had been searched 20 hours earlier. Daniel Kowalski's body was discovered in a location that required breaking trail through untouched snow, yet his body showed no evidence of walking there, and no one had seen him during 11 days of active searching. In 73% of cases where bodies were eventually recovered, the recovery location had been previously searched. In 31% of cases, the recovery location had been searched within 24 hours of the body being found. In 12% of cases, the recovery location had been searched within 6 hours of recovery. These statistics cannot be explained by search team error. The teams involved are professionals. They use GPS to document their coverage. They mark areas as cleared only after thorough examination. They do not miss bodies lying in open terrain. The only way to explain the statistics is to accept one of 2 possibilities. Either the bodies were not present during earlier searches and appeared later, or the bodies were present but somehow not visible to searchers. Both possibilities violate normal understanding of how physical objects behave. Bodies do not teleport. Bodies do not become invisible. Yet the data consistently shows bodies being found in locations that were demonstrably empty hours or days earlier. Some researchers have proposed that the victims may still be alive during earlier searches, hidden somewhere, dying later, and somehow being transported to the recovery location after death. This would explain how a location could be empty during one search and contain a body during a later search. But it does not explain cases like Marcus Webb, where the body was found with no tracks around it, or Daniel Kowalski, where the body appeared in a location requiring a miles-long trek through deep snow that left no trail. Other researchers have proposed that searchers may experience perceptual interference, an inability to see what is present in front of them. The 4 witnesses who saw Brian Patterson's body on the ski slope, while other skiers passed by without reacting, may be evidence of this phenomenon. The body was there. Most people could not see it. A few people could. Catherine Novak and her 3 friends watched Brian Patterson's body for approximately 30 seconds from the chairlift. They saw skiers passing within yards of it, apparently unaware. When they reported what they had seen, patrol found nothing. 2 hours later, the body was there. Catherine has never been able to explain what she witnessed. She told investigators she is certain the body was there at 2:30. She is equally certain patrol would have found it if it had been there when they searched at 2:45. If this explanation is correct, it suggests that whatever operates in winter wilderness has the ability to affect human perception. It can hide things from searchers. It can make bodies invisible until it chooses to reveal them. It can allow certain people to see what others cannot. This is not a capability that any known natural phenomenon possesses. It is not a capability that current science can explain. but it is consistent with the patterns in the data. Patterns that document bodies appearing in searched locations over and over again, in case after case, across decades and thousands of miles. The evidence points towards something with intention, something with capabilities beyond normal understanding, something that has been operating in winter wilderness for a very long time. The fifth pattern involves what happens to survivors. In the rare cases where victims of unexplained disappearances are recovered alive, they share a consistent characteristic. They remember nothing. Rachel Morrison spent 13 days in winter wilderness in Glacier National Park and could not account for any of them. She was found walking near a road 18 miles from where her tracks had ended, showing no signs of hypothermia, frostbite, or dehydration, despite nearly 2 weeks in sub-zero conditions. Her food was untouched. Her water bottles were full. Her emergency supplies had not been used. She remembered reaching a trail marker on the morning of January 19th, 2020. Her next memory was strangers asking if she was okay, 13 days later. Other survivors show similar memory gaps, ranging from hours to weeks. They remember starting their trip. They remember reaching a certain point on the trail. Then there is nothing until they wake up or are found, often in a location far from where their last memory occurred. Medical evaluation of these survivors typically finds no physical cause for the amnesia, no head trauma, no hypothermia severe enough to affect brain function, no drug exposure, no psychological condition that would explain selective memory loss. The memories are simply gone. Some survivors report fragmentary dreams or impressions from the missing period. Rachel Morrison dreamed of being underground, in a warm space beneath the snow, with something large and patient waiting nearby. She described it as a hollow area where the cold did not reach. She said she did not feel afraid in the dreams. She felt safe. She felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Other survivors have reported similar imagery: a hollow space, warmth despite the cold above, a presence, a feeling of safety and belonging. These reports are consistent enough across unconnected survivors that researchers have begun to take them seriously. Perhaps they are memories that have been suppressed but leak through in dreams. Perhaps they are something else, images implanted to replace the real memories that have been removed. Without understanding what actually happens during the missing time, researchers cannot distinguish between these possibilities. What researchers can document is the effect on survivors afterward. Almost all report lasting changes following their experience. Difficulty returning to wilderness areas, anxiety in winter conditions, a feeling that something is watching them, and paradoxically, an occasional urge to go back, to find the hollow space again, to return to whatever was waiting there. Rachel Morrison told interviewers 2 years after her experience that she sometimes wakes with an intense longing to return to the mountains in winter. She said she does not trust these feelings. She said she believes something happened to her, that her conscious mind is not allowed to remember. She said she will never go into the winter wilderness again. She said she is afraid of what she might remember. She said she is more afraid of what might be waiting for her. Some survivors resist this urge successfully and go on to live relatively normal lives. Others do not. Among survivors who return to winter wilderness after their initial experience, the recidivism rate for unexplained disappearances is significantly higher than the baseline. People who have been taken once are more likely to be taken again. This pattern suggests that whatever takes people from winter wilderness maintains some kind of ongoing connection to survivors. It knows who they are. It can find them again. And some part of the survivors, perhaps the part that remembers what the conscious mind cannot, wants to be found. The evidence documented across this investigation does not point toward a conclusion. It points toward questions that current understanding cannot answer. What ends tracks in the middle of flat trails? What moves bodies into previously searched locations? What allows some people to see things that others cannot? What takes the memories of survivors while leaving their bodies unharmed? What creates the patterns in geography and timing that cluster these cases in specific places and conditions? The indigenous peoples who lived in these areas before European contact had answers. They spoke of beings that inhabited certain mountains and forests, entities that had existed there for longer than humans, powers that could take people into their realm, and sometimes return them changed. These stories were dismissed as superstition by settlers and scientists. They are still dismissed by official investigators who encounter unexplained cases. But the stories are remarkably consistent with the evidence. Indigenous accounts describe beings that operate in specific locations, that prefer certain conditions, that take some people and not others, that can make things appear and disappear, that leave survivors with no memory of their experience. These are exactly the patterns documented in modern cases. The Arapaho people, whose traditional territory includes portions of what is now Rocky Mountain National Park, spoke of spirits that lived in certain high places. These spirits were not malevolent, but they were dangerous. They could take hunters who ventured into their territory during certain seasons, under certain conditions. Some hunters returned with no memory of their time away. Others never returned at all. The Ojibwe people of the Superior National Forest region had similar traditions. They identified specific lakes and forests where people should not go alone, especially in winter. They said the beings in these places could hide themselves from human eyes, could make themselves visible only when they chose. They said these beings had been there since before the Ojibwe arrived, and would be there long after humans departed. The Shoshone people of the Yellowstone region warned against certain thermal areas. They said the steam and heat were doorways to another place, and that beings moved through these doorways according to their own purposes. They said some people were called to these doorways and could not resist the urge to enter. These traditions do not explain the mechanism. They do not tell us what these beings are, where they come from, or why they take people. They only confirm that the phenomenon has been occurring for a very long time, long enough that the people who lived here first developed traditions and warnings to account for it. Those traditions said to avoid certain areas in certain conditions. They said some people were more likely to be taken than others. They said survivors should be treated with care, watched for changes, protected from the urge to return. They said the beings were not malevolent, not exactly, but they were not safe either. They operated by their own rules for their own purposes, and those purposes did not necessarily align with human survival. Modern search and rescue teams operate without this traditional knowledge. They enter winter wilderness assuming that normal rules apply, that tracks lead somewhere, that bodies stay where they fall, that diligent searching will produce results. They are unprepared for what the evidence shows, that something in winter wilderness violates normal rules, that it hides evidence and reveals it on its own schedule, that it takes people according to criteria we do not understand and returns them, or does not, according to logic we cannot follow. The cases in this investigation represent a fraction of what has occurred. Researchers estimate that for every documented case meeting their criteria, 3 to 5 additional cases exist that were never properly recorded, investigated, or recognized as unexplained. The true scope of the phenomenon may be far larger than anyone realizes. And it continues. The most recent case in this investigation occurred 11 months ago. On January 8, 2025, a 44-year-old attorney named Catherine Wheeler went snowshoeing alone in the Adirondack Mountains of New York State. She was an experienced winter hiker who had completed dozens of backcountry trips over a 15-year period. She had summited Mount Marcy, the state's highest peak, in winter conditions 3 times. She served on the board of the Adirondack Mountain Club and had helped organize wilderness safety workshops. She filed a detailed trip plan with the Forest Service, carried a satellite communicator, and expected to return by mid-afternoon. She did not return. Search teams found her snowshoe tracks the following morning. The tracks led from the trailhead into the wilderness for approximately 2 miles. They crossed a frozen stream, climbed a moderate ridge, and descended into a small valley on the other side. In the center of the valley, the tracks ended. Her trekking poles were planted in the snow at the final footprint, standing upright as if she had stopped for a moment and simply ceased to exist. The pattern matched Christopher Reeves's disappearance exactly, 7 years earlier and 1,500 miles away. The snow around the final prints was undisturbed. There were no signs of struggle or distress. The track simply stopped, as if Catherine had been walking through the valley and then vanished mid-stride. The satellite communicator she carried was never activated. Her emergency supplies were never used. The search continued for 14 days before being suspended due to hazardous weather conditions. Teams covered every accessible area within 12 miles of the point where her tracks ended. They found nothing. No body, no equipment, no indication of where Catherine went or what happened to her. The area where Catherine disappeared is within the Adirondack Cluster Zone, one of the 7 primary areas where unexplained winter disappearances concentrate. January 8th fell within 72 hours of a significant snowfall. A temperature inversion had settled over the High Peaks region on January 7th. The full moon had occurred on January 6th. All 3 high-probability factors were present. Catherine Wheeler was physically fit, running half marathons regularly. She was experienced in winter wilderness, with more documented winter backcountry trips than most search and rescue personnel. Her maiden name was Hoffman, indicating Germanic heritage. She had been described by co-workers as distracted and preoccupied in the days before her disappearance, staring out windows during meetings, losing track of conversations. She matched the victim profile. She was in an active cluster zone during a high-probability window. Every factor that researchers have identified as increasing the likelihood of an unexplained disappearance was present. When spring came and the snow melted, search teams returned to the valley where Catherine's tracks had ended. They found nothing. No remains, no clothing, no equipment. The mountain gave up none of its secrets. Catherine Wheeler has been missing for 11 months. The search has been suspended indefinitely. Her case file remains open with the New York State Police and the Adirondack Forest Rangers. It contains 147 pages of documentation, search logs, GPS data, weather reports, witness interviews, and a handwritten note from the lead ranger on the case. The note reads, "I have been working searches in the Adirondacks for 19 years. I have found people who died of hypothermia, exposure, falls, heart attacks. I have found people who got lost and people who made poor decisions. I have never found a case I could not explain. Catherine Wheeler is the exception. Her tracks ended in the middle of a valley with no explanation. Her poles were standing in the snow. She was simply gone. I do not know what happened to her. I do not know where she went, and I do not believe I ever will." This investigation documented 12 cases across 7 states, spanning 15 years, tracks that ended without explanation, bodies that appeared in previously searched locations, survivors with no memory of days or weeks in conditions that should have killed them within hours. The evidence is consistent across all 12 cases. The patterns are statistically significant and cannot be explained by chance or search team error. The victim profiles, geographic clusters, timing factors, and search interference phenomena all point toward something systematic operating in winter wilderness. The evidence does not identify what that something is. The evidence only confirms that it exists, that it has been operating for decades or longer, and that it continues to take people according to criteria we are only beginning to understand. If you have experienced something in winter wilderness that matches the patterns documented here, leave a comment below. Researchers are actively collecting accounts from survivors and witnesses. Every report helps identify patterns that have been hidden for too long. If you plan to enter one of the 7 cluster zones during winter conditions, be aware of the risk factors this investigation has identified. Pay attention to recent snowfall, temperature inversions, and lunar phases. Notice if you feel distracted or preoccupied in the hours before your trip. Tell someone exactly where you are going and when you plan to return. Carry a satellite communicator and do not hesitate to use it if something feels wrong. Trust your instincts. The indigenous peoples who lived in these areas for thousands of years understood that certain places, during certain conditions, were not safe. That knowledge was dismissed by the culture that replaced them. The cases documented here suggest it should not have been. Subscribe if you want to see what we investigate next. Turn on notifications. The winter wilderness continues to take people according to rules we do not understand. The victims deserve to be remembered. The cases deserve attention. And the patterns we have documented deserve to be known, even if they cannot be explained. Every winter, people enter the 7 cluster zones. Some of them do not return. Some of them return with no memory of where they have been. Some of them are found in locations that had already been searched, their bodies appearing as if placed there by something that wanted them to be found. The evidence exists. The patterns are real. The explanations remain beyond our current understanding. And somewhere in the frozen wilderness, during the 72 hours after fresh snowfall, under temperature inversions, near the full moon, something continues to operate according to its own purposes. Something that has been taking people for longer than recorded history. Something that prefers the experienced over the novice, the fit over the average, certain bloodlines over others. Something that can end tracks mid-stride. Something that can hide bodies from professional searchers and reveal them hours later. Something that takes memories and leaves survivors with dreams of warm, hollow spaces and patient, waiting presences. The snow falls. The conditions align. The next person who matches the profile enters the cluster zone. The investigation continues.